Hello and welcome to a character analysis video on A Friend Remembers. This is going to be a deep spoiler-filled guide into the character of Lady Alcina Dimitrescu from Resident Evil 8 or Resident Evil Village, depending on how you want to read those hidden Roman numerals. Now, Village is a very interesting game. It had pretty unanimous critical applause when it came out, but there is a seething well of discontent from some Resident Evil fans a little bit dissatisfied with what the game did. I'm not one of them. For me, it's my second favourite game in the franchise, sitting right behind the original Resident Evil 4, and I think that might be telling. Resident Evil 4 is very unlike the first three games in the series. It started the series down an action-packed movie-style route, rather the first three games were much more horror based. Unfortunately, the franchise then really struggled to walk that tightrope with 5 and 6, leaning much more in the AAA blockbuster action movie direction before Resident Evil 7 snapped it back into the horror vibes. This is a series in a deep identity crisis. Is it an action AAA B-movie, whatever grade of movie you want to know? Is this an action-packed spectacle with monsters and mutants and zombies and our heroes valiantly saving the day? Yes, but is it also a tense, creeping, nervous dread that there's something around the corner that's absolutely terrifying and you don't know if you've got the equipment, the preparation, the health to deal with it? It should be that as well. And when the games don't walk that tightrope, for some people they really fall over. And 7 was so brilliant, at least for the first half of the game, at introducing back that tension, nervous aspect. And then after 7 we had two fantastic remakes of Resident Evil 2 and 3. And there's another thing that these games did. They recapitalised and reintroduced the concept of the stalker enemy. Right the way back in the original Resident Evil 3, and there are other examples, but Nemesis is always going to be the most famous one. There was one villain who pursued you for the majority of the runtime of that game. You could fight him, you couldn't win, you just had to run and slow him down and get out of there. And at the end of the game, it was so satisfying. If you didn't have to, you turned around and finished him off. But it was so hard to reach that point and so satisfying when you achieved it. And so when Resident Evil 7 came out, they really piled in on this. They had the idea of these characters who were pretty much immortal. You could unload a shotgun in their face and they'd just shrug it off. Jack Baker was a really intimidating villain. He stalked around his house. He got up close in your face. He was really just the worst side of male aggression. He was the fantastic father gone wrong trope. The guy who's going to take his belt off and strap you on the face, only you wouldn't go away. It was really disturbing for the people who played Resident Evil 7. And then with the remake of Resident Evil 2, they upgraded one of the characters from that original game, Mr. X, put a little hat on him and had him pursue you around the RPD and the laboratory of that game. Again, another relentless killer. You couldn't beat him, you couldn't shoot him, and in that game you could hear his footsteps from several rooms away. Maybe he was on the floor above you, or maybe he was just on the other side of the door that you were about to go through. If you could hear him stomping his way around, he'd moved quite fast, actively looking for you, actively hunting you down. It was really tense. It was heart-stopping gameplay, trying to make your way, trying to complete your objectives without stumbling across them, because if you did, you just had to run. Nemesis in the Resident Evil 3 remake, on the other hand, almost because they felt afraid of repeating themselves, they treated slightly differently. The guy who is most famous in the franchise for being a relentless pursuer almost is relegated to cutscenes and quick time events. It's just not the same as it was in the original Resident Evil 3, which is the game that introduced this concept and did it so well back in the 1990s. So we had two fantastic stalker enemies in Mr. X and Jack Baker in their respective sections in their game, and one severely downgraded Nemesis. But the new entry in the franchise is where it really mattered. Village was announced, and I think Capcom were really taken by surprise by the insanely positive reaction to Lady Alcina Dimitrescu. She was revealed and teased as the new class of stalker enemy, 9 foot tall. She had to physically crouch down to fit through doors to pursue you. Now that's intimidating. It's different to the up-close griminess of Jack Baker and the intimidating dread of Mr. X and Nemesis charging towards you. This is a lady with poise and regal charm, but devastatingly sharp claws if you let her get close. The concept is there. It's fantastic. And then people started playing Resident Evil Village, and they realised the game wasn't quite what they had expected it to be. Now, that's not the same as it was in what Capcom had billed it as. Capcom had been quite specific. The game is set in a village. There are 4 lords who lord over this village, working for Mother Miranda. You're going to have to defeat the 4 lords. But I don't think anyone was expecting the game to be as linear. You deal with one lord, then the next, then the next. It's Dimitrescu, House Beneviento, Miro in the lake, and then Heisenberg in the factory. You always do it in that order. There's no alternative. Which means that Lady Dimitrescu, despite being the maybe second longest of those sections, is dispatched a quarter of the way into the game. That's not a problem. That's not bad design. The castle, Dimitrescu Castle, it's not a fantastic area. It's a promising area. It's got all the right feels. It looks good, but it's just a little bit too short. It's not as big as the police station in Resident Evil 2. It's maybe even slightly smaller than the Baker household where Jack pursues you. There's just not quite as much depth for her to pursue you around, and there's too many safe rooms that once you get to know the castle, it's really easy to avoid Lady Dimitrescu. And then you pick up a knife, you stab her, she turns into a giant rampaging monster, and you kill her. And I played through the game and I was satisfied, but I was left with the sensation that I wanted more. I was disappointed that she died so easily and so quickly. It makes sense in terms of the game that Capcom were telling and the story they wanted to tell. It doesn't make sense when you realise how the hype of the game and the pre-advertisements, which, you know, it makes sense for Capcom. She's the first of the 4 lords, the first of the 4 villains. So they showed the most of her gameplay off before the game started. And people really liked that. They wanted more of that. They saw that and said, yes, that's what we want a large portion of Village to be. But that's not the game. That's the first level. It's a problem. We all had mixed or misprioritized expectations. And you can't exactly blame Capcom for that, but at the same time you can. Lady Alcina Dimitrescu felt like she deserved more. And it was only on my second playthrough of Resident Evil Village that I realised just how bad the situation was. So, you enter the castle and she is not there. You encounter her in a cutscene and then she disappears. You will not encounter her again until another cutscene, which is maybe a third of the way through the castle. Now, you can encounter her daughters. They establish that she's not the only stalker. She has 3 daughters who will also briefly pursue you, not in the same way she will. They won't follow you from room to room in the same way she will, but if you enter their domains, they will attack you and you will have to retreat. And you can only defeat these 3 daughters in very specific scenarios. You've got to meet them in a specific boss room and take them down in a very, very specific fashion. And you will kill one of them before you encounter Lady Dimitrescu again. Your next seeing her will be her reacting in outrage the fact that you've killed one of her daughters. You'll then dispatch the second daughter quite quickly if you know where you're going. She will be pursuing you, but there's a brief, excellent bit of pursuit in an area you can't go back to later in the game, and then you take on the second daughter. And then if you go to the right room, you can see a brief monologue of her informing the third daughter that there's no playing around, you've got to take you out. But she doesn't pursue you onto the roofs, which is the main area you're going next. She only does there's essentially 2 loops around the main hall, and then the eastern rooms around the piano. She does 2 loops around those 2 areas, and that's less than half of the total real estate of her castle that she won't enter. So she doesn't actively start pursuing you until you've already done half the castle, and even then she won't enter half the areas that you're going to. So is she really that intimidating? Well, no, she's just not got the same level of intimidation that any of the previous Stalker villains had. She joins you too late, starts hunting you too late. She's too slow. Despite her size, she's very slow. And it's too easy to avoid her. There's too many rooms she won't follow you into. And then the boss battle is just, I mean, it's a good boss. I enjoyed it. I think it's quite riveting and it's well designed mechanically. But I wanted more. How much better would Resident Evil Village have been if you left the castle with the knife and then came back to dispatch her later? If you returned to the castle and she was still waiting for you and hunting you, or if you left the castle and she pursued you into the village and you went back. If Capcom hadn't been so obsessed with this linear function of Area 1, Area 2, Area 3, Area 4 and done, there could have been more. Now, probably the House Beneviento was all it needed to be. That was a fantastic section. I don't know if you could have made that much longer without diminishing it, and returning there probably would have also had diminishing returns. The same for the lake. It was an action set piece, but the castle was always designed as this sort of throwback to the history of the franchise, bringing back the big mansion from Resident Evil 1 with the stalking villains, for the sort of a combination of Mr. X and Tyrant and Nemesis from Resident Evil 2 and 3, and it's just over too quickly. Anyway, that's my thoughts. I really love this game, Resident Evil Village, but I'm not beyond seeing the criticisms that could be levelled at it. I really liked what we got, but it needed more.